Hello, I'm AxelMC131 and welcome back to Starsector, and I've got something a little bit different for you guys today. This is not a pure gameplay video, this is actually a video tutorial for a very important and fundamental gameplay mechanic, which is carrier command. Now, a few people have been talking about this on both the forums and the Discord, and I'm one of those people who desperately thinks there should be a carrier command tutorial in the game alongside the combat and fleet command tutorials in the main menu, because a lot of people are often coming in and being like, oh, you can press Z to make your fighters go and fly away and engage the enemy? I didn't know that! Yeah, we need a tutorial for this stuff. So, I have finally decided to step in, and I'm going to attempt this myself. And I'll be covering most of the basics, and a couple of little extra bits as well, for how it all works, and I'm gonna try and split it up into several sections, to keep things nice and simple and distinguished. So, we might as well get straight into the very, very basics, which is basically how you fit fighters onto carriers, and how you then use those fighters in combat. Since Starsector version 0.8, fighters are no longer classed as ships in your fleet. They are instead classed technically as weapons, and you find them in the form of fighter LPCs, or limited production chips. These are basically computer chips that you plug into a carrier's nanoforges, and it then reads the blueprint and prints out a fighter matching that blueprint. Now, much like weapons, these are fitted onto certain slots. Now, carriers now have fighter bay slots, and you can fit any fighter LPC into any fighter bay slot as long as you have the ordnance points for it, and the carrier will then produce those fighters in combat. When you deploy a carrier into combat, it will automatically deploy all the fighters it's carrying into their respective wings, and for a start they will hang around their respective carrier like this. Now, when you're in command of a carrier, there are a few new elements of the UI that you need to pay attention to, and they're at the bottom of the screen underneath the weapon groups readout. And the first one that we're going to look at is the order mode. Now, fighters have two orders, regroup and engage. By default they're set to regroup and they'll hang near the carrier. If you set them to engage by pressing the Z key, they will instead fly off and attack the most appropriate target. If you don't have a target set, I believe they will attack the nearest target, or nearest to your mouse cursor, and if you mouse over a target and press R, they will attack that target. You can press Z again to recall the fighters, and by putting them into regroup mode, at which point they will break off their attack and head back to the carrier, and then they will continue to hang by the carrier until you tell them to engage a target again. It's also important to note that for carriers, an additional special function occurs here. When a carrier sets its fighters to engage mode, it loses its zero flux engine boost, even if it's not firing any other weapons or using its shield. It can regain that flux boost by setting its fighters to regroup mode again. The next stat that we're going to look at is the carrier replacement rate, and this is a percentage value which is listed at the bottom of the screen alongside the current fighter order, and admittedly this is where it gets a little complicated. Now, as fighters are killed, your carrier will try and build replacement units up to the maximum wing size, and this taxes the ship's replacement rate, which is an indication of how stressed the ship's nanoforges are. While fighter wings are at or below 2/3 of their maximum complement, the replacement rate will start to drop and fighter replacement will slow down, bottoming out at 30%. It's also worth noting that when fighters are destroyed, you can see them become greyed out in the UI at the bottom of the screen, and they become illuminated again once the fighter has been replaced. Once your fighters are back above 2/3 complement, the replacement rate will start rising again. Ordering fighters into regroup mode slows the rate at which the replacement rate decays, and also increases the rate at which it picks up again once your fighters are at full complement. Replacement rate is an important stat to pay attention to, especially for combat carriers, as you can get carried away and easily lose track of it, and then suddenly realise that you're at 30% replacement rate and you're not getting any fighters for a while. So it pays to pay attention to that value, and when it starts getting low, set your fighters to regroup, bring them home, keep them safe. One final note on replacement rate: in case of a very, very prolonged engagement, it's also important to remember that when carriers reach 0% combat radius, they will immediately stop launching replacement fighters. While fighters are primarily considered a carrier's main weapons in a combat engagement, they can also be used defensively in a support role. By targeting a friendly or allied ship by mousing over and pressing R, and then pressing Z to order your fighters to engage, those fighters will then fly over to that target and escort it instead of attacking it. Fighters will continue to escort the ship even after the target has been cleared, and will only move away from its side when a new target is selected or when the carrier recalls its fighters again. The next mechanic we're going to look at are the different roles that fighters can take and how they affect their behaviour in combat. There are 4 main roles that fighters can take in the current game. These are Fighter, Interceptor, Bomber, and Support, and we'll look at how each of these behave in turn. Fighters marked with the Fighter or Heavy Fighter role, such as the Broadsword, and those marked as Interceptors, such as the infamous Talon, are the most basic form of fighter. When deployed into combat, these will hang near the carrier, generally around the front of it, and when asked to engage a target, will fly out and start to kite the target while firing their weapons at it in the best way they see fit. The difference between fighters and interceptors is that fighters will attempt to prioritize warships, while interceptors will prioritize attacking enemy fighters if there happen to be any in the vicinity. The next type of fighter that we're going to look at are bombers, such as the ubiquitous Piranha bomber. Now, unlike heavy fighters or interceptors, bombers hold position near their carrier behind it, and this is in order to keep them safe while they're not actually performing an attack run. When ordered to engage, bombers proceed towards their target at best possible speed and begin launching any expendable ordnance they happen to have towards that target, and they will continue to do so until they run out of ammo. Once bombers have completed an attack run, they will turn around and start making their way back towards their parent carrier. Bombers are fairly unique among fighters, and their behaviour has some interesting effects on replacement rate and fighter refit time. When bombers run out of ordnance, they will actually become greyed out in the UI as if they were dead, and the game treats them as being dead even if they're still alive on the screen. And what this means is that while your bombers are out of ordnance and returning to a carrier, the replacement rate will start to drop. However, when a bomber manages to reach its carrier and land, it will take only a few seconds before it relaunches, unlike if it had been destroyed and had to be rebuilt from scratch. This is quite an important mechanic, as it means that you have an incentive to protect your bombers in combat and get them back to your carrier rather than having to rebuild a fresh replacement. The last fighter role we're going to look at is the support fighter, of which the Xiphos is the only example in the current game. Support fighters are unique among fighters in being unable to directly engage an enemy target. They will continue to hang by their own carrier regardless of whether the current order mode is on engage or regroup, and also regardless of whether the carrier has other fighters which are engaging as normal. The role of a support fighter is to hold near its carrier and provide it with fire support or defensive fire, and the Xiphos is a good example of this as it carries a very long-range ion beam and a burst PD laser, so it can provide long-range harassment as well as point defense near its carrier. Finally, while support fighters cannot engage targets, they can still be used to escort friendly ships in exactly the same way as any other ship, by pressing R to target the ship and pressing Z to order it to engage. The fighter will then escort the targeted ship as per normal. Now we'll take a look at some of the fighter-specific statistics that diversify the variety of wings we have at our disposal, and we're going to start with engagement or support range. Fighter engagement range is the rough maximum range at which a fighter can engage a target, and can be compared to standard weapon ranges. In fact, it uses the same unit, incidentally. There is some leeway in the actual number to avoid fighter bouncing issues at peak range, but for the most part it represents the maximum distance a carrier can be from its target before its fighters will no longer leave its side to attack. Now, most stock fighters have a standardized range of 4,000 units, that's about 4 grid cells on the tactical map, except for 2 exceptions. There are the long-range Thunder Heavy Interceptor, which has 8,000 range, and the Mining Pod drone, which actually can't leave its carrier's side, even though it's not a support fighter, because it has 0 engagement range. Engagement range is one of the key advantages of fighters in combat, which is the ability to attack a target at far greater range than standard shipborne weapons can. The next stat is replacement time, which is the base amount of time it takes a carrier's nanoforgers to build a replacement fighter if one is destroyed. This varies greatly across fighter wings, from the utterly idiot-proof Talon Interceptor to the hugely advanced and intricate Trident Bomber. The difference that refit time makes in combat can be quite significant. In this clip we have a carrier armed with a wing of Talons, which have a 5-second rebuild time, and a wing of Warthog assault fighters with a 15-second rebuild time. If we watch the carrier as they are taken out by hostile fire, we can see that 3 Talon fighters can be rebuilt and launched in the time it takes a single Warthog to do the same. Refit time is influenced by the carrier's replacement rate, as we covered earlier, and a lower replacement rate means slower fighter replacements.